He wasn't supposed to survive. The words echoed in the empty space of the base as the last remnants of morning fog clung to the metal gates. Max, a German shepherd with a dark sable coat and eyes full of waiting, stood motionless. His posture was rigid, as if every fiber of his being was in tune with a single purpose: to wait. The cold breeze swept over the deserted base, its chill biting through the silence, but Max didn't flinch. His amber eyes were locked on the gate, unwavering. Days turned into weeks, and still, he stood there, as if defying the passage of time. Every day, the Marines passed by, giving him fleeting glances, but none of them dared to approach. They didn't understand the bond he shared with the man who had once walked beside him, through thick and thin, side by side in combat. His name was James Carter, a Marine who had once been Max's closest companion on and off the battlefield. The two had been inseparable, their loyalty unbroken by time or distance. But now, the very man Max had waited for was miles away, recovering from wounds in a distant hospital. Yet here he was, day after day, at the base gate, waiting for something that felt impossible, something he couldn't quite name. The other soldiers had tried to coax him inside, but Max refused. It wasn't just a gate. It was the threshold to something he couldn't explain, something he couldn't leave behind. James had been his protector, his partner, the one who had saved him from countless dangers. But now, it was Max's turn. He had to wait. The fog began to lift, revealing the barren, frost-covered ground beneath the base's towering gates. Max's breath came in steady bursts, the only sign of life in an otherwise silent world. For a moment, he seemed to give up, slumping slightly as though the weight of the weight had finally become too much. But then, just as the light of day pierced through the clouds, a figure appeared at the far end of the base. It was him, James Carter, though not as he remembered him. He was slower now, his uniform a little more worn, his steps uncertain, but the recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. Max's tail twitched, then began to wag furiously. He had seen this man before. This was his Marine. He had been waiting for him, and now, against all odds, he had returned. James stopped in his tracks, his breath catching as he saw Max. The bond between them, the unspoken connection, surged through both of them like a lightning strike. Max's tail wagged harder, his paws moved with purpose, and within moments, he was bounding toward James. Every step was a testament to their shared history, to the countless battles they had fought side by side. The reunion wasn't just about the two of them. It was a moment that spoke to the power of loyalty, of love, of a bond that could never be broken, no matter the distance, no matter the time. As James knelt down, Max leaped into his arms, his body trembling with excitement and relief. The wait was over, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them, reunited at last. The moment James held Max in his arms, it felt as if the entire world had paused. His heart, once heavy with the weight of uncertainty, now swelled with an overwhelming sense of peace. Max's body, trembling from excitement, pressed against him, his familiar scent filling James' senses. It had been so long since he had felt this closeness, the kind of bond that could never be broken. "Good boy, Max," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name, his tail wagging even harder, as if to confirm that the reunion was as much of a miracle to him as it was to James. James slowly stood up, supporting Max, who was now pulling him forward, eager to continue the journey they had once shared. It was as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. The world had moved on, but they had not. Together, they were still a team. As they walked through the base, the Marines around them glanced up, witnessing the reunion that seemed so unlikely, yet so powerful. Some whispered among themselves, others simply nodded in understanding. They had seen James return from battle, but they had never seen him this alive, this complete. It was as if Max had breathed new life into him, pulling him from the shadows of his past and reminding him of the man he used to be. James and Max continued, walking, side by side, the bond between them undeniable. James' pace was steady, though his steps still carried the weight of the trauma he had endured. But with Max by his side, the weight seemed a little lighter, the world a little brighter. They reached the small house James had once shared with his family before the war. It looked the same, though time had weathered it. Max's nose twitched as he sniffed the air, his senses picking up on the familiar sense of home. James opened the door, stepping inside for the first time in months. The air was still, almost as if it had been waiting for their return. Max trotted in ahead of James, his tail wagging as he explored every corner of the room, as though marking the place as his own. James sat down in the armchair by the window, his eyes scanning the empty room. It was quiet now, peaceful. The memories of the past seemed to linger, but they no longer felt like a burden. Max padded over and sat beside him, resting his head on James' lap. James smiled, reaching down to stroke his companion's fur. "We're home, buddy," he said softly. The silence between them was comforting, filled with understanding. Max let out a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he leaned into James' touch. It wasn't just a homecoming. It was the beginning of something new. A new chapter, one where the horrors of the past could be left behind, where James could finally heal. And as the sun set outside the window, casting a golden glow across the room, James knew that no matter what came next, he and Max would face it together, just as they always had. James sat quietly by the window, gazing out at the fading light as the evening settled over the town. The house, though small and simple, felt like home again. Max rested beside him, his head nestled on James' lap, his deep, steady breathing offering a sense of calm that James hadn't felt in months. There were no sounds of war here, no distant explosions or shouts of command. Only the soft rhythm of Max's heartbeat and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. It was peaceful, but in that peace, James felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't realized he had been missing all along. Hope. He had spent so long trying to outrun the past, trying to silence the memories that haunted him. But with Max by his side, he could finally begin to let go. He ran his fingers through Max's fur, a gentle reminder that some bonds never break, even through the toughest of times. Max looked up at him, his amber eyes full of understanding, as if he knew exactly what James was feeling. There was no need for words between them. Their connection was enough. As the days passed, James began to settle into a new rhythm. He took long walks with Max through the quiet streets, their footsteps the only sound in the stillness of the early mornings. Max trotted beside him, his ears perked, his eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert, always ready. James had always admired Max's loyalty, but now, in this quiet life, he saw something more. He saw the way Max had always been there for him, how the dog had never once left his side, even in the darkest moments. The bond they shared was something that couldn't be broken, not by time, not by distance. It was a bond forged in the fires of war, in the heat of battle, and it had survived the test of time. And now, in the calm after the storm, it was stronger than ever. One morning, as they walked through the park, James stopped by the old oak tree they used to sit under during their brief moments of respite while deployed. He leaned against the tree, taking in the quiet, the peace that surrounded him. Max sat beside him, his gaze soft, as if understanding the significance of the moment. It was a moment of reflection, a moment to remember the man he used to be and the man he was becoming. He was no longer just a soldier. He was someone who could heal, who could move forward. With Max at his side, he was ready to face the future, no matter what it held. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the park, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had come home, not just to a house, but to a life that was no longer defined by the past. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to embrace that life. Max stood, as if sensing the shift in his owner's mood, and nudged James gently with his nose. James smiled, ruffling Max's fur as he stood up. Together, they walked back toward home, side by side, ready for whatever came next. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with Max by his side, James knew one thing for sure. He was never alone. James stood in the doorway, looking out at the horizon as the first rays of the morning sun broke through the clouds. The world seemed to breathe in sync with him, slow and steady, as though it too had been waiting for this moment. Max, always by his side, sat beside him, watching the same view with unwavering loyalty. The quiet of the morning, the fresh scent of earth and pine, felt like a new beginning. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, James didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. He had learned that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and he had already taken the first step. Max's presence was a reminder of that, of all the battles they had fought together and the bond that had carried them through. No words were needed between them. The silence was enough. James had spent so many years buried in the chaos of war, in the constant noise of conflict, that he had forgotten what peace felt like. But now, with Max at his side, he had rediscovered it. The quiet mornings, the simple moments, felt like treasures, something he had almost lost forever. And as he looked down at Max, who was now standing, his ears perked, James knew he wasn't alone in this. Max was there, as he always had been, ready to walk alongside him no matter what. As the days went by, James found himself reconnecting with parts of his life he had long since abandoned. He began taking small steps, like walking to the nearby cafe in the mornings, sitting down with a cup of coffee, and simply watching the world go by. He even started chatting with the regulars, something he had never thought he would do again. Each conversation, each small interaction, reminded him that there was life outside of the uniform, outside of the war. It was a life he had almost forgotten, but now, it was beginning to feel real again. Max was with him every step of the way, his faithful companion, always by his side, whether they were walking through town or just sitting together in the quiet of their home. It wasn't just the physical steps that were important. It was the emotional journey they were both on. They were healing together, finding a new purpose in the world they had once known and lost. James looked down at Max, who was watching him with those knowing amber eyes. It was as if the dog could see straight into his soul, understanding him better than anyone else ever could. And in that look, James felt a deep sense of gratitude for Max's loyalty, for the bond they shared, and for the second chance at life that was unfolding before him. He wasn't sure where the road would take them, but with Max at his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would build a new future, one step at a time. James woke up early the next morning, the soft light of dawn peeking through the curtains. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles, a constant reminder of the years he had spent on the battlefield. But today, there was something different, something lighter. As he stood up and walked over to the window, he saw Max lying on the floor, his body curled into a tight ball, asleep but still alert, as always. James smiled softly. Max was always watching, always ready. It was something that never changed. Even though the war was behind him, the bond between them remained unbroken, and it was in those quiet moments, when Max's presence was the only thing that mattered, that James found peace. Over the next few weeks, James began to notice the small changes in himself. He no longer jumped at every noise or woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. He could feel his heart slowing down, the constant tension of fear and anxiety starting to ease. Max, of course, had been with him through every nightmare, every restless night, never once leaving his side. They spent their days walking through the park, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. James would sit on a bench, watching people go by, while Max would chase after a stick, or lie beside him, always close, always calm. For the first time in a long time, James felt a sense of normalcy. It was nothing extraordinary, just the quiet comfort of being present in the moment. One afternoon, as they walked through town, James found himself smiling at a family sitting on a bench with their dog. The child was laughing, throwing a ball, while the dog happily chased after it. It was a scene so ordinary, yet so beautiful in its simplicity. James felt a surge of gratitude. It wasn't the things he had once thought were important, the medals, the accomplishments, the battles won, but these simple moments of peace that had begun to define his life. As they made their way back to the house, Max stopped suddenly, his ears perking up as he sniffed the air. James looked down at him, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, his voice soft. Max turned and started walking in the direction of the park, his tail wagging slightly. James followed, curious but trusting Max's instincts. They reached the park, and James sat down on a bench, watching as Max trotted ahead. He paused near the small playground, where a young couple was sitting with their child. Max approached them cautiously, tail wagging, and the couple smiled at him. The little girl reached out to pet Max, and he leaned into her touch, a soft whimper escaping his lips. James watched the scene, feeling a warm, quiet happiness. It was a reminder that there was still love and kindness in the world, and that sometimes, all you needed was to be open to it. Max returned to James, who reached down and ruffled his fur. "Good boy," he murmured, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. It wasn't just the bond between him and Max that mattered. It was the bond they shared with the world around them. Together, they were part of something bigger, something beautiful, and that was enough. The mornings had begun to feel like a new chapter, each one bringing a sense of peace that James hadn't known in years. Max was always there beside him, his faithful companion, providing a silent reassurance that life was moving forward, one day at a time. James had found a new rhythm in the simplicity of his daily routine. The walks through the park, the quiet moments spent on the porch, the laughter of children playing nearby. It all felt like a world he had once lost but was now finding again. Every morning, he would sit on the porch with Max by his side, watching the world wake up around them. He had started to take pleasure in the little things, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of the birds singing, the way Max's fur caught the light as he sat, tail gently wagging. It was a kind of peace James hadn't realized he had been missing, the kind of peace that comes when you stop running from your past and learn to be present in the moment. As the days passed, James found himself reconnecting with people he hadn't spoken to in a long time. He went back to the local diner, where the familiar faces of the townspeople greeted him with warmth and kindness. There, he would sit and chat with the waitress, an older woman named Betty, who always had a story to tell. The small town, which had once felt too quiet, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could start anew. One afternoon, as he and Max walked through the town, they came across a small group of children playing in the park. James watched as Max trotted over to them, his tail wagging enthusiastically. The children giggled, delighted by Max's gentle nature, as he let them pet him, his large head leaning into their small hands. James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It was moments like these that reminded him of the true healing power of love and loyalty. Max had been a source of strength for him in ways he couldn't fully express. In return, James had become a source of comfort for Max, offering the dog a safe space to rest, to be loved, and to simply be. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the town, James sat on a bench, watching the horizon. Max lay beside him, his head resting on James' foot. It was as if, in that moment, time had slowed down just enough for them to savor the peace they had found. There was no rush, no need to go anywhere. They were home, together. The weight of the past no longer hung over James. He no longer carried the burden of what had been. Instead, he focused on the here and now, on the life he was building with Max. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but James had learned something important over the last few months. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and finding a way to move forward. He looked down at Max, whose amber eyes met his with a quiet understanding, and he knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it together, side by side. James woke up to the soft light of early morning filtering through the curtains. The house was still quiet, save for the steady breathing of Max, who lay peacefully by his feet. For a moment, James simply sat there, taking in the tranquility that had become a part of his everyday life. It was a far cry from the noise and chaos he had once known, but now, it felt like the only reality he wanted. The past months had been filled with small moments of peace that he had longed for, and now, he cherished them. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his body that was slowly beginning to fade. It was a reminder that, even though the physical scars of war remained, there was a sense of healing in the quiet moments, in the simplicity of life. As he stood and made his way to the kitchen, Max followed, always a step behind him, as if they had become one in their routines. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as James poured himself a cup. He took a sip, savoring the warmth that spread through him, and then sat down at the small wooden table. Max lay at his feet, content and calm, his eyes following every movement James made. The bond between them had only grown stronger over time, and James could not imagine a life without him. As the day unfolded, James felt the weight of the past slowly lifting, piece by piece. He had started to reconnect with old friends in town, people he hadn't spoken to since before the war. One by one, they began to stop by the house, bringing with them the small joys of everyday life. Laughter, stories, and a reminder that the world outside was still turning. These interactions, though simple, brought him a sense of belonging, a feeling he hadn't realized he had been missing. The small town, once a place he had thought he'd outgrown, now felt like a sanctuary. He found comfort in its quiet streets, in the familiar faces that greeted him each day. And Max was always there, by his side, steady as ever. That afternoon, as James and Max walked to the park, James found himself feeling lighter than he had in years. The park was filled with children playing, families enjoying the warmth of the sun, and people walking their dogs. Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging, stopping to greet a few familiar faces. James watched him, a soft smile crossing his face. He had never realized how much he had missed these simple moments until now. The world around him seemed so full of life, so full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to embrace it. As they sat on a bench, the warmth of the sun on his face, James thought about how far he had come. The road had not been easy, and there were still days when the memories of the past crept in. But with Max at his side, he had found a way to move forward. It was not about forgetting the past. It was about accepting it and learning to live in the present. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the park, James felt at peace. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he was no longer afraid of it. He had Max, he had the support of his friends, and most importantly, he had found his place in the world again. He looked down at Max, who was resting his head on James' foot, his amber eyes meeting his with quiet understanding. In that moment, James knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the days passed, James found himself falling into a new sense of normalcy, one that had once felt impossible. Max was there, as always, his presence a steady reminder of the bond they shared and the healing that was taking place, even when James didn't realize it. Life, once filled with tension and constant motion, had slowed down. The pace of the small town, the daily walks with Max, the conversations with neighbors, these things became the foundation of a life that was simple but meaningful. James had started spending more time in the garden, a small patch of land behind the house that he had once neglected. Now, he found solace in tending to the plants, watching them grow and bloom as the seasons changed. It was a small thing, but it gave him a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that he was nurturing something. Max often followed him into the garden, lying in the sun or trotting around the yard, his nose twitching at the scents of the flowers. It was in these quiet moments, surrounded by nature and Max's unspoken understanding, that James realized just how far he had come. The darkness that had once consumed him was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer had control over him. He had learned to live with it, to move forward despite it, and most importantly, to embrace the moments of peace that he never thought he would experience again. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, James sat on the porch, Max by his side. The air was warm, but the evening chill was starting to creep in. James looked out at the horizon, the colors of the sky shifting from gold to pink as the day came to an end. It was a peaceful sight, one that he had come to appreciate in ways he hadn't before. Max rested his head on James' lap, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes, full of quiet affection. James ran his fingers through Max's fur, a soft smile playing on his lips. "We've come a long way, haven't we, buddy?" he whispered. Max responded with a soft whimper, as if in agreement, his tail giving a slight wag. In that moment, James realized that, while the past would always be a part of him, it no longer defined him. The life he had now, the one he had been building with Max, was his future. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, James leaned back in the chair, taking in the peaceful night. The gentle breeze, the sounds of crickets, and Max by his side made it feel like everything was as it should be. For the first time, he didn't feel like something was missing. With Max, he had everything he needed. Together, they were a team, and they would face whatever came next, just as they always had. James woke up early the next morning, feeling a new sense of purpose. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow through the curtains. Max was already awake, his body curled up at the foot of the bed. The silence of the morning was comforting, a reminder of how far he had come. The house felt different now, not just in its quiet, but in the peace that filled the spaces. It had become a home in the truest sense, a place where James could finally begin to heal. As he got out of bed and walked over to the window, he felt the familiar weight of the world on his shoulders, but it no longer felt as heavy as it once did. He had spent so many years trying to outrun the past, trying to bury the memories that haunted him. But now, with Max by his side, he had learned to accept them. They were part of him, part of his story, but they didn't define him anymore. He had found a way to move forward, to build a life that was his own. Max followed him into the kitchen, always close, always ready to be by his side. James poured himself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth that spread through him as he took the first sip. Max sat at his feet, looking up at him with those amber eyes, full of trust and loyalty. It was in moments like this that James felt the depth of their connection. It wasn't just about being there for each other in the hard times. It was about the quiet companionship, the simple moments that made life worth living. As the days passed, James began to feel a renewed sense of energy. He started taking on small projects around the house, fixing things that had been left undone for too long. He even started going back to the gym, something he had never made time for since his return. Max, of course, was always there, whether it was by his side during a walk or curled up on the couch while James worked. The routine of it all was grounding, and as the weeks went by, James found himself growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. He had started to open up more, too, talking with the people in town, reconnecting with old friends. The quiet town, which had once felt so isolating, now felt like a community, a place where he could belong. He even started volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping to care for the dogs that reminded him so much of Max. It was in those moments, when he saw the way the dogs looked up at him with hope in their eyes, that James realized just how much he had to give. He had spent so much of his life taking orders of duty, taking time away from what mattered most. But now, he was learning how to give back. Max had been the first to show him that. As the days continued to unfold, James began to see his life not as something he had to fix, but as something that was worth living. He wasn't defined by his past. He was creating a future, one day at a time. And no matter what came next, he knew that with Max by his side, he could face anything. Together, they had built something real, something that could weather any storm. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The mornings had become a peaceful routine, one that James had never thought he would experience again. He woke up early, the soft light of the rising sun casting a warm glow over the room. Max was already awake, lying by the bed, his eyes following James as he moved. The dog had become more than just a companion. He had become a symbol of everything James had fought for, everything he had hoped to reclaim. They had both come a long way from the chaotic days of the past, and now, each day felt like a gift. James stretched, feeling the pull of his muscles, a reminder of the work he had put in to heal both physically and emotionally. He walked to the window, looking out over the small town, the familiar sights now filled with a sense of comfort. The streets, the parks, the homes, they had all become part of the life he had rebuilt, and it felt like home. Max padded over to James, his tail wagging, his presence a steady reassurance. James reached down, running his fingers through the dog's fur. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was stronger than anything James had ever known. It wasn't just the way Max had helped him heal. It was the simple fact that Max was there, always by his side, no matter what. As the days passed, James began to feel more and more like himself. The physical scars were fading, but it was the emotional ones that were taking longer to heal. He had spent years living in the shadows of his past, but now, with each passing day, those shadows were becoming less and less daunting. He was no longer afraid to face the future, no longer consumed by the pain of what had been. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was his, and that was enough. James started taking on more projects around the house, fixing things that had been left undone for too long. He even began helping his neighbors with small tasks, finding a sense of purpose in the simple acts of kindness. The people in town had begun to notice the change in him, the way he was opening up, the way he was no longer hiding behind the walls he had built for so long. It was a small town, but it had a way of making you feel like you mattered, and James found that comforting. One afternoon, he took Max to the local park, a place they had visited often. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and there was a sense of calm in the air. Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging as he sniffed the ground, his ears perked, always alert. James sat on a bench, watching him, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The park was full of families, children playing, couples walking hand in hand. It was a reminder that life, despite its struggles, was still beautiful. As he sat there, James realized that he had finally found a sense of belonging. It wasn't just the town, or the house, or even the people. It was the life he was building, piece by piece, with Max by his side. He wasn't alone anymore. He had come to understand that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And while it had taken time, James had finally learned to embrace it. He looked down at Max, who was now sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those amber eyes. In that moment, James knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. They had found their peace, and that was enough. The weeks went by, and James found himself more at ease with the life he had created. It wasn't the life he had once imagined for himself, but it was the life he had now, and for the first time, he was learning to embrace it. Max, always by his side, had become his anchor, his reminder that no matter what the past held, there was always room for hope. They spent their days in the same simple routine: morning walks, afternoons in the garden, quiet evenings on the porch. Each day, the world seemed just a little brighter, a little more peaceful. James could still feel the weight of the past in moments of silence, the echoes of the person he used to be. But it no longer felt like a burden. He had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting and finding the strength to move forward. The quiet town had become his sanctuary, a place where he could build the life he had once thought impossible. The people in town had come to know him, and though he had always kept to himself, he had started to open up. He spent more time with his neighbors, lending a hand when he could, and even began to feel the stirrings of a new sense of community. The town was small, but it was full of warmth and kindness, the kind of place where people looked out for one another. It was in the simple interactions, helping a neighbor with groceries, chatting with the shopkeeper, exchanging a smile with a passing stranger, that James realized he had begun to feel like part of something larger. One day, as he sat in the park, watching Max run around, his tail wagging with excitement, James felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't experienced in years. The park was full of families, children playing, couples walking hand in hand. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of ordinary day he had once taken for granted. But now, it felt like a gift. He had been so caught up in the chaos of the past, in the memories of war, that he had forgotten how to enjoy these simple moments. But now, with Max at his side, he had learned to appreciate them. He leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his skin. Max came over and sat next to him, resting his head on James' lap, as if sensing the peace that had settled over his owner. James smiled, running his fingers through the dog's fur. The connection between them, the silent understanding, was stronger than ever. He realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with Max by his side. The journey they had shared, the bond they had formed, had given him the strength to move forward, to rebuild his life. And for the first time in a long time, James felt ready. He wasn't the same man he had been before the war, but he wasn't the same man he had been when he first returned either. He had grown, he had healed, and he had found a new sense of purpose. With Max, he had found something he had lost, a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, James knew that, no matter what came next, he would be all right. He had Max. He had this life. And for now, that was enough. It was a crisp morning when James woke up, the first chill of autumn seeping into the room. The quiet stillness of the house wrapped around him like a blanket, and for a moment, he simply lay there, listening to the soft rhythm of Max's breathing. The dog had always been a constant presence, but now, after so many months, it felt like they had become two halves of the same whole. The bond they shared was undeniable. Max had become more than just a companion. He was the anchor that had kept James grounded, the lifeline that had pulled him out of the darkest parts of his past. As the days went by, the familiar feeling of peace settled deeper into James' bones. He had begun to appreciate the simple moments, those fleeting seconds that most people overlooked. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on his face, the way Max's fur felt beneath his fingers as they walked together through the quiet streets of the small town. These were the moments that mattered now, the things that made life worth living. The town had embraced him in a way he hadn't expected. At first, he had kept to himself, preferring the solitude of his home and the companionship of Max. But now he found himself spending more time in town, talking with neighbors, helping out at the local diner, and even attending the occasional community event. It felt strange at first, this sense of belonging, but the longer he stayed, the more it felt like he was becoming part of something larger. A community that valued him not for his past, but for who he was now. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch, watching the world go by, a sense of contentment washed over him. It wasn't just the quiet, the peace, or the beauty of the town. It was the fact that he had found a place for himself, a place where he could heal, and more importantly, a place where he could grow. Max was by his side, as always, his head resting on James' lap. James ran his fingers through the dog's fur, a soft smile spreading across his face. "We've come a long way, buddy," he whispered. Max's ears perked up, his eyes meeting James with that familiar look of understanding. It was as if the dog could hear the unspoken words, the gratitude, the love that James had for him. James knew that without Max, he wouldn't be here. Without Max, he wouldn't have been able to see the beauty in the world around him. He wouldn't have been able to rebuild his life the way he had. As the seasons shifted and the air grew colder, James found himself reflecting on the journey he had been on. It hadn't been easy, and there were still days when the shadows of his past threatened to pull him back, but he had come to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to accept it, and to move forward in spite of it. And with Max by his side, he knew that anything was possible. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, James wasn't afraid. He had found his way home, not just to the town, but to himself. And that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, James and Max continued their quiet life, each day feeling like a new opportunity to embrace the world around them. James had never imagined that he would find this level of peace after everything he had been through. But here, in the stillness of his home and the companionship of Max, he found something he had been searching for, a sense of belonging. The town, once a place he had barely noticed, now felt like a part of him. The people, the familiar streets, the rhythm of life, they had all become threads in the fabric of his new existence. He spent his mornings in the garden, tending to the plants that had begun to grow under his careful hand, their green leaves a reminder that life could still flourish, even after the hardest of winters. Max was always there, watching over him as he worked, his eyes full of quiet understanding. It was in these simple moments, working side by side with Max, that James realized how much he had healed. The scars from the war, both visible and hidden, had not vanished, but they no longer controlled him. He had learned to live with them, to accept them as part of who he was, and most importantly, he had learned to move forward. One afternoon, as James sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Max curled up at his feet, he thought about the journey they had both been on. It had been a long and difficult road, filled with challenges, but it had brought him here, to this moment, to this life. He had found a new purpose, not in the battles he had fought, but in the quiet moments that made life worth living. Max shifted slightly, resting his head on James' foot, and James reached down to stroke the dog's fur. They didn't need words. Max's presence was enough. James knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The world outside was changing, but within the walls of their home, things felt steady, constant. The peace James had found wasn't fleeting, it was real, and it was something he could hold on to. The town had become his home, not because of the house he lived in, but because of the life he was building within it. It was a life he had chosen, a life he had worked hard to create, and with Max by his side, it was a life he was ready to live. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to understand that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and each day was a step forward. Max had been his guide, his companion, his constant through it all. And as the stars began to appear in the clear night sky, James knew that, with Max, he had everything he needed. Together, they had found a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, James was ready to embrace whatever came next.